You're listening to There Ought to Be a Law, the Center for Auto Safety podcast with Executive Director Michael Brooks, Chief Engineer Fred Perkins, and hosted by me, Anthony Cimino. For over 50 years, the Center for Auto Safety has worked to make cars safer. Hey, listeners, welcome back. We're continuing with Phil Koopman, who's going to talk a little bit more about his book coming up, hopefully this fall. We're all looking forward to it. So, Phil, can you break us down the 4 core areas of what's coming out?
Sure. The book is about embodied AI safety, and that's not just robotaxis, but it uses robotaxis as lessons learned because we've learned so much. And I try and zoom back up, and it's not just a technical book about here's how to do the machine learning or here's how to define safety, although all those things are in it and are important. I start out saying that if you want to play the embodied AI safety game, robotaxis or otherwise, home house bots, whatever it is, there's 4 things you need to really understand. And a lot of the problems we've seen, especially in robotaxis, are because teams were weak in one of the 4 areas. The first area is you need to know safety engineering. And the big idea for safety engineering is you identify the hazards and you mitigate the expected risks due to that hazards. That's the core of safety engineering. If you're just driving around to see what happens, you're not doing safety engineering. And it's astonishingly, people think, well, if there's no bugs, it's safe. Well, no, you can have perfect software that does something dangerous and it's not safe. So the first thing is safety engineering, hazard analysis. The second thing is you need to know security. Because if you're not secure, an attacker is going to compromise your safety. And so it talks about threats, identifying threats and identifying vulnerabilities and countermeasures and just basic security principles. The next thing you need to know is machine learning. And you need to understand that machine learning breaks the usual assumptions behind safety and security. For example, safety likes software to always do the same thing the same way every single time it's run. Yeah, that doesn't work for machine learning. So safety also implicitly assumes there's a person who's responsible for doing things like, well, it's too much rain, you shouldn't fly, or it's too much ice, or it's too dark, you shouldn't put this robotaxi on the road. There's a person who's there to take responsibility for enforcing limitations. And if you're autonomous, now the computer has to do that. And most of the safety standards don't talk about things like this. The traditional safety standards assume that you have a defined environment and for defined use, and they don't talk about misuse and abuse, and they don't talk about what happens if the environment changes in an unexpected way. So you need to understand the limits of machine learning, and the basic idea there is that everything is statistical rather than deterministic, and statistical can be really amazing for very cool functionality. And as the further you go down the cool functionality path, the harder you make safety. So you need to understand that's going on. But the fourth one that not near enough people talk about is you have to understand people and the limits to people. People have a limit to what they can comprehend, how fast they can react, and those things are coupled together. People make mistakes. That's what people do. And if you want to get safety, blaming people for being people is not going to get you there. So you need to understand engineering, security engineering, you need to understand machine learning, and you need to understand human factors, especially perception response time. You need to understand those things if you're going to make safe embodied AI. And anyone who goes into the game with a big gaping hole in the knowledge on any one of those 4 things is not going to get there. And a lot of what we've seen is teams who have too much of a gap in one of those areas, putting products out there that turn out to have problems.
I want to ask about the last part, the perception response time. So we have autonomous vehicles on the road. Are you referring to the response time of the pedestrians out on the street, the other drivers? Are you referring to
all of it?
Okay.
All of it. But the place that really bites you the most are in these hybrid systems, and it isn't just cars, where you have a person and you have a machine learning-based system that are collaborating somehow. That's where you get into trouble. And even robotaxis, all robotaxis right now have a human driver. Many of them don't want to call it a driver, but they all have a human driver. And by driver, I mean someone who can, if they make a mistake, cause a crash.
Right.
And so as far as we know, the Teslas, we have pretty good information available saying that Tesla's operating in Austin right now actually have remote drivers with steering wheels and brakes and gas, and they're basically acting the same as an FSD supervisor, except they're remote, and they're expected to jump in and prevent a crash. But if just as if they were in the car, if the car does something crazy faster than they can respond, they can, if it's faster than they can respond, they can't respond, and response times can be not just handfuls of seconds, they can be tens of seconds, depending on what's going on. But even the Waymo Cruises of the world, there was a Waymo mishap where it was stopped at a red light, but it wasn't sure it was a red light. And so it phoned home and said, "Is that light red?" And the remote assistant said, "No, it's green." So it went through the intersection, and a light motorcycle, like a moped rider, wiped out trying to avoid hitting it. Now, in what world is that not a driver?
Right.
The driver made a decision that caused a wreck. How is that not a driver, right? Now, Waymo says, well, the car is responsible for safety, so they didn't blame the driver, which is good. But it turns out that remote assistant, if they can control any aspect of vehicle behavior, even if it's just, well, they just get a vote, yeah. But if they're the penny that switches the balance from one side to the other, how is it that they're not participating in the bad thing that happened?
So how does that work? So for example, with Tesla, you're talking about, so let's pretend it's 1-to-1. Right now, I think our impression is it is 1-to-1. So you have one robotaxi in the road and you have one person in an
That's my expectation as well.
Right.
And when China launched robotaxis, that's what they did too. So Tesla's not the only folks to have launched robotaxis like this.
But eventually, their goal is to scale out for economic reasons. We'll have one person monitoring X number of vehicles.
One expects, and while I don't have first-hand info, I've heard from reasonable sources that this is already going on in China, that there are already multiple vehicles per supervisor. Because that's the only way you can possibly afford to build a robotaxi fleet, right?
Right. So you've talked about this issue on past episodes, whereas there's that response time, there's that latency, that delay of what is it? Because I mean, it's obviously we're not connected in real time to those cars. There's always going to be some level of latency. They're connected over a cellular network. We know calls, data get dropped all the time. Like this is normally a question I'll ask Fred is, hey, Fred, do some math. These cars are driving 30 miles per hour. Someone in a remote office sees an issue. If they're fully engaged, let's pretend they're fully engaged, fully caffeinated, not distracted by anything, that kind of response time for them to engage and cause the robotaxi to not cause an accident, is that possible? Like at what speed does it no longer become possible, I guess?
Well, the videos I saw for Austin on the first day operations, they were at 35, 36, 37, 38. They're at 35 miles an hour, which is pretty borderline. If you hit a pedestrian at 35, you're going to do some damage. It's well above 20, which is the much less fatal speed. But I think people sort of get it wrong here. They say, well, we're going to measure from the time something bad happens and then the camera has to scan it, and then it has to be sent over a data link, and then you have to see it on your display, and you have to twitch the steering wheel, and then the steering wheel has to be sent back to the car. And for sure, that data transmission and steering wheel and display and cognitive processing and all that stuff back and forth takes time. And if you do the math, there's not enough time to respond. But if you do the math, a lot of times there's enough time to respond even if you're in the car. So what's going on?
A little more time in the car.
Well,
slam on a brake.
So for sure, having a remote driver makes it worse. There's no question.
Right.
There will be crashes where that time difference is what made the difference.
Okay.
But I'm going to go a different way. And this has more to do with why computers cannot and sometimes not be as safe as people. If you look at the data for human drivers, as you get older, your reflexes slow, right? Like a lot. So I do not have the reflexes I had when I was 17. There's no way, not even close, okay? But if you look at the AAA data for fatal crashes, fatalities go down and keep going down till you're in your 60s. And the main reason they go up in your 70s and 80s is not because you're old and senile. It's because by the time you're 80, it doesn't take much of a crash to kill you. Mm. It's much more about that than it is about anything else. So we have this really weird thing where a 17-year-old, it's just scary as anything. And you have to be like in your 20s before you're down in the sweet spots. And so as you're slowing down, as your reflexes degrade, you're getting safer. What's going on there? Okay, now that's data. That's well-established data. I'll tell you my own personal theory is that wisdom trumps reaction time. People said, well, cars will be safer because they can see everything. We talked about the cruise bus last time. Just because they can see it doesn't mean they won't hit it. And also because they can react faster than human. Well, if they react stupid, it's not going to avoid it. So a lot of this safety driving is knowing that something bad's about to happen and avoiding it before the last second twitch response. And the problem you're going to have with remote drivers is they're going to lack the feel of the vehicle. It's going to be a little bit harder, and they're looking through a camera. It's just going to be that much harder. They don't have the audio cues, not as well. It's going to be that much harder to pick up the subtle things remotely, and it's going to require them to anticipate and avoid crashes. But if they've been told, don't intervene unless you have to because we need good stats, then they're going to have to let the car do dangerous things. And by the time they figure out it's not going to avoid a crash, that it'll be too late to jump in. And this has been a problem for safety drivers who are in the vehicles. And I think being remote is going to make it worse because of the time lag and because their sensor information is going to be degraded in quality. It just won't be the same as being there. I tried driving in a simulator once, and I was terrible at it. And I finally figured out it's because I wasn't getting road feel on corners.
Oh, that's fascinating.
That's what was nailing me. I kept flying off corners because I didn't have road feel on corners. And I was looking for the banking, the super elevation. I was looking for these very subtle hints. And I'm a terrible remote driver. I'm a terrible simulator driver because I depend too much on the kinesthetic clues. So, there's stuff going on. Now, can they, if they're trained and experienced and they have a crack team of a dozen or 24 of the world's best drivers, can Tesla make the robotaxi safe? Well, it's plausible. I don't know how you scale that to 1 million vehicles, though.
Yeah, and I don't see how you save any money hiring crack drivers to do this remotely. But that's that's not a safety issue.
The story they're going to give is, well, at first, of course, we do this because we're paranoid about safety. And anytime, any minute now, it will no longer need interventions. And then we can go to supervising 2 and 4 and 8 and 32, and then eventually switch to what Waymo does, which is they don't supervise at all. So the other difference is it your job to jump in and save the day, which is really hard for all those reasons? Or is it the robotaxi's job to know when it's in trouble and get itself to a safe place and ask permission by phoning home, which is what Waymo does? So Tesla's looking at a big transition when they can go from having to keep an eye on it to having it call home. Because when you have it call home, then the time pressure is off. The perception response time is a huge deal when you're dealing with complex situations with limited information. And if you don't act fast enough, someone dies, right? That's really hard. The idea for Waymo and other companies is, well, you take that out of the equation a bit by having the robotaxi get itself safe and stopped and waiting for help, and then have the person remotely help it. And that sounds great, except there's cars honking at you while you're waiting.
Sure. And
then it's going to be a call center. So a lot of call centers, they get judged on how many seconds it takes to answer your question, right? Because economics and metrics, and it's going to end up there sooner rather than later. And so we're back to, they jump into a complicated situation. They have no idea what's under the car. They have no idea the car just ran someone over, thinking of the cruise mishap. And the time pressure's on, and it's complicated. And if they make a mistake, it's bad. And of course, people make mistakes. That's what people do. And so that's where the Waymos and everyone else who doesn't need constant supervision ends up. And I'm not saying anyone does it poorly. I'm just saying it's a tough gig. And it's really challenging to design a system where you're going to have very, very, very few bad outcomes.
This is my ideal childhood fantasy. I guess it's never going to come true. Huh? So,
well, I mean, if you get into a robotaxi and there's no driver in the front, do you really care what's going on behind the scenes as long as it has a safe outcome?
I guess not, but I liked in Tesla's terms of service where it says we cannot guarantee that you'll be dropped off at the location you requested. which
Yeah,
I thought
well,
was amazing. But
they've all had this. Well, and then you get into personal safety. What if it drops you off in a really dangerous place? We've seen
right.
issues with that. Yeah.
Well, so I want to go back to perception response time because now I want to talk to the pedestrians outside the vehicle because we've talked about this where, you come to a four-way stop and everyone doesn't have their DMV manual in there. Wait, who has the right of ways? Is the cars to my right that got there first or is it to the left? How do we do this? So as humans, we all just kind of make eye contact and figure out who's going to go for it. We do this with pedestrians. Are they actually crossing the street? Are they waving me on? There's no one in the car. How do you have that nonverbal communication?
Well, that's tough, right? And you can do some of it by when people who aren't great at eye contact. Not everyone is good at eye contact, it turns out. Okay.
Sure.
You inch your car forward a little bit and see if everyone else inches forward. You knew that. You can use vehicle motion as a communication mechanism successfully, and I expect that's what the robotaxis are going to have to do, right? But there's another thing from a purely engineering point of view that gets really tough. The law says whoever arrives first goes, and if it's at the same time, it's the person on the right. And there's two issues. What if all four arrive at the same time? And we've all sort of been there, okay? But the other one is, what if the guy on the right, what if the guy on your left arrived 1/10 of a second before you? What if it's 1,000th of a second? How many people can measure 1,000th of a second while they're driving? Nobody, right? Okay, well, the computer can. So even though it arrives second because it's on the right, it should go first because the person isn't going to realize that they have the right of way and you're going to have to wait. And so you need to, if you're building a computer that has better perception, raw perception, not understanding, but better sensor ability and better timing estimation ability than the person, you have to model what the person's experiencing to be able to act like a human in those situations. Because the goal isn't to not be blamed. The goal is to not have the crash. And those are often two different things. So you need a model of how people act so you can act like a person if you're in mixed traffic, or you can have bad outcomes.
Or we do better training and force these systems to read the U.S. Coast Guard's rules of the road. They all follow that.
I was quite proficient at the rules of the road at one point in my life.
There you go.
But even there's a lot of really weird situations where what you have to do kind of doesn't make sense, but if you do the right thing, it's your fault. So you do something crazy because you never want it to be your fault, right?
Right. I was told the perfect example. I gave some obscure, convoluted example, and the captain looked at me and goes, "Don't hit the other boat."
Yeah.
I'm like, "Yeah, oh yeah, that's the goal."
But that's one of the goals. But the other goal is there's a thing you're not supposed to turn right. You're supposed to turn left. So do you turn right 1 degree or do you turn left 359? The answer is you turn left 359 because then it's not your fault.
Right. Exactly. So going back to your table of contents, your index, one of the great titles that we grabbed on was "To LiDAR or Not to LiDAR."
Yeah, that is the question. You set it up for me. I couldn't resist, right?
Oh, good. It is the question, of course. And this is the big debate because all these analysts these financial analysts that I think are clowns are like, well, Tesla's system is going to be cheaper because they haven't added all these things. And I'm like, well, yeah, you remove seatbelts, the car will be cheaper too.
Well, as a hint, there are a few sections that the early version shows up in my Substack. So that's one of them, and you can put a show note to point to that one. But I'll give you the short version. But the vast majority of the book is stuff no one's ever seen. To be clear, it's not just a clips. It's not a clips show. Okay, it's new writing. But everyone goes, well, Tesla LiDAR, everyone else. I'm sorry, Tesla not LiDAR, everyone else LiDAR, LiDAR bad, LiDAR whatever, and I make the point that's the symptom, not actually what's going on. And so the way I look at it is the business choice is that you can have a few number of test vehicles with really good sensors, or you can have a huge number of vehicles, but with poor sensors because you can't afford. 10 years ago, you couldn't afford to put a LiDAR on every one of a million cars. It was just economically infeasible, or even if theoretically economically feasible, Tesla chose to do something else with their money, right? So it's a huge amount of money. So if you have 1 million vehicles and you don't have LiDAR because you're financing it by selling vehicles as opposed to financing it by having billions of dollars of venture capital, that's certainly good for you in a business sense, okay? But you don't have LiDAR, what do you do? Well, it sends you down a different development path. If you have LiDAR and you have these great sensors, the componentized machine learning, which I talked about in the last episode, where you have chunks of machine learning. This chunk does perception, this chunk does planning, this chunk does something else. And often the chunks are even finer grained than that. If you have really good quality data, you want to have people label that's a car, that's a road, that's a person, that's a whatever. It's a really expensive way to get and curate data, but you get super high quality data, and it's really easy to train little chunks on it. But if you don't want to spend the money on the LiDAR, but you have a big fleet, well, then you have a lot of data that is lower value per data sample because it's not labeled. You can't afford to label hundreds of thousands of hours of data. It's not happening, right? Okay. And by the way, not Waymo specifically, but other teams like them had 5,000 full-time employees, 1,000 full-time employees, thousands of full-time employees just at contractors labeling data, all right? So you're not going to scale that up by a factor of 100. So, but you have all this huge amounts of data. What do you do with it? Well, you go to end-to-end machine learning, where you just throw a bunch of data in, and you tell it, and you judge it on whether it goes faster, slower, left, right. Sort of like got your rolled up newspaper, good dog, bad dog, goes it the wrong way. You say, here's a video clip. Did you want to go left? Bad dog, go right. Okay. And eventually it starts learning to go right on that data. And so it's a lot cheaper. It's a lot easier to build a system if what you have is a ton of unlabeled data. And so the component versus end-to-end is sort of motivated by this choice about whether to put the LiDAR in or not. Right. So it's sort of backwards. People say, well, LiDAR good, not LiDAR bad. Well, it's like, no. It's a different design choice. And really it boils down to componentized versus end-to-end is where you end up. Now, I think end-to-end is problematic for safety because dealing with edge cases is really awkward and difficult. Okay. But it's not because there's no LiDAR. It's because the technology is tough. And if you're using cheap cameras, that's certainly not going to help. Although the newer Tesla cameras are better resolution, and I'm not sure if that's enough resolution, but it sort of ends up there. And so people get hung up on LiDAR, and it's actually a package deal. It's a whole bundle of design choices to use these high value sensors or to use a bunch of training data. And now there's a third option. The Wobbies of the world have this third option that they're not going to use road data because Tesla primarily trains on road data. And if you have a big fleet, you'll see a lot of stuff. So all that makes sense. And Waymo started by having to have their own test track where they set stuff up and use simulations. But the third option is to use large language models, that other piece of AI technology, and ask the large language model to create a bunch of synthetic simulation data out of thin air. So you can use the end-to-end learning, but you don't have to go out on the road and collect data because the LLM just coughs up a bunch of data. Here's a clip of street data. Could you make that car into a truck? And could you change this from red to green? And can you have a kid chase a ball from the side and it'll come up with a picture and you train on it? So that's sort of a third. There's three choices, right? There's component-based with high-quality data. There's end-to-end with huge amounts of lower quality data, not necessarily bad data, just not high-quality data. And the third one is using end-to-end with synthetic data from large language models. So that's the three games in play right now. And it's too early to tell who's going to win. Waymo's ahead, but we're in the first innings. The game's not anywhere near over.
Right. That last option sounds incredibly flawed to me because it's who's creating these scenarios and they have a limited worldview.
You take real data and you have the large language model train on real data and you say, given this frame, what's likely to come next? And so it's just like large language model. You put a bunch of words in, you say, what's the next word? You put a bunch of frames of video and say, what's the next frame? And then you say, yeah, that's cool, but I want you to make this change. Now what's the next frame? And use that instead of a physics-based simulator. That is what some companies are doing. Wobby's the one who's been talking about it, but they're not the only ones looking at that kind of thing.
Yeah, I just think is what we were talking about is the, safety is the edge case. Like all these accidents happen with things that we don't think about. We don't think about, change this to a truck or a boy chasing a ball type thing.
And if you think about all the changes and put them in the physics generated by the large language model based simulation, it's not actually text trained on the internet. It's
Sure.
all vision based, but it's the same technology. If you think of all the things to train it on, maybe it gets them, but you have to make sure you think of all the things, and you have to make sure that the things, the potential edge cases you're thinking of match up with where the behavior discontinuities are in the technology. So it may have really weird notions of things that it has trouble with that would never occur to a person. And so you say, fine, we trained on this simulator and the simulator did everything possible so we know it's safe. And my answer is define everything possible. And how do you know your simulator really did that, right? And of course, it's not going to be perfect. And not being perfect is okay because it's not about perfection. It's okay to not be perfect. It's, do you meet all the definitions of safety, which is a whole different discussion we had.
Yeah, right.
It's not just the reduced body count. It's also, are you driving recklessly? Are you putting passengers at better safety at the cost of more risk to pedestrians? There's a bunch of things you have to look at.
Right. Did the street planners put the utility pole on the curb or in the road?
Was it protected by a curb or hanging out in the middle of the road, just waiting for a robotaxi to crash into it? Yeah.
Okay. Before we finish, Michael, is there anything you want to add? Nope. Michael's got to run for it. Phil, anything you want to wrap up on?
Well, we missed the obligatory Piggly Wiggly reference because Fred wasn't here, but
yes.
But that's now been corrected, Fred. So I hope you enjoy this when you listen to the episode.
There you go, Fred. Piggly Wiggly's taken care of. While you wait for Phil's next book, you can pick up his last book, How Safe is Safe Enough. I've read it. It's actually great. It is totally accessible. I know a lot of people come into this field and they think, oh, I can't read this book. There's no way I could understand this. Not true. Phil's an excellent writer. Very easy to get a grasp on things. Highly recommend it. And then come back in the fall and I'll highly recommend your next book unless I don't understand it. No.
Well, we'll see how that goes. Thanks for having me on, Anthony, right. and Michael. Really appreciate it.
Thanks a lot, Phil. Bye.
For more information, visit www.autosafety.org.